Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Saratoga Foundation's online event, Putin's Nuclear Messaging and the Oreshnik Missile Test, Bluff or Coercion. We're delighted that you're taking the time to join us by watching our exciting discussion today. On November 21st, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the launching of a new experimental missile called the Oreshnik. Traveling at a reported speed of Mach 10, President Putin indicated that he had created a new WunderWaffen, or superweapon capable of penetrating Western airspace and striking anywhere in Europe. A week later, he announced the missile had begun widespread production, threatening a new missile race aimed at Europe and the United States. So, what was the weapon in reality? Was it an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, or was it an intermediate range ballistic missile, also known as an IRBM? The difference between the two is quite important to understand these distinctions. For this very reason, we put this panel together today because there was a political dimension behind the launching of the Oreshnik. Many journalists in the Western media followed the Kremlin's use of reflexive control by becoming focused on whether this was a new superweapon, conveniently missing what the messaging was behind the launching of this new missile. Prior to the launching of the Oreshnik, the Ukrainian government was permitted for the first time by the outgoing Biden administration to fire long-range ATACMS into Russian border areas to defend its forces in Russia's Kursk region, which is occupied since August 8th. So where are we today? Are we on the threshold of World War III, or are we simply becoming victims of Putin's nuclear coercion strategy? Is Putin's objective to escalate the stakes in Ukraine by launching the new Oreshnik missile as a warning to the United States and NATO to avoid helping Ukraine deter Russia in its ongoing war against Kyiv? We don't know. Hopefully, we can get answers to these questions today from a distinguished group of experts who know these types of details and can help us decide on who exactly this nuclear messaging was directed at. Was it aimed at the new president-elect now living in Mar-a-Lago? Or was it a warning to the outgoing Biden administration, which had recently given Kyiv permission to use American long-range ATACMS to strike Russian forces in Kursk? Helping us today to dissect these events are three distinguished experts. The first speaker is Pavel Luzin, who's a noted expert on the Russian military and security issues, who is currently a senior fellow at the Saratoga Foundation. And he's also a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. Our second speaker will be Andrei Illarionov, who is a former high-ranking Russian government official who previously served as an economic advisor to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Andrei is currently a senior analyst at the Center for Security Policy. We should listen closely to what Andrei has to say, as he previously predicted the Russian financial crisis in 1998 and has been frequently right on many things occurring inside Russia ever since. Our third speaker will be Philip Breedlove, who is a member of the Saratoga Foundation Board of Directors and is the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe and is someone who has been tracking Russian malign activities ever since Putin seized Crimea in 2014, when General Breedlove served as Supreme Allied Commander. General Breedlove has also been active in the hunt to stop a Russian aggression ever since. He has also seen many Russian missile launchings in his lifetime, and he will help us understand Russian aims behind the Oreshnik missile launching 2 weeks ago. You may ask, why is this important today? Because the nuclear message continues. This discussion is all about President Putin and how he's threatened to conduct another missile launching of the Oreshnik again in the near future. So, Pavel, you'll be the first speaker. So, kind of discuss with our audience, what is the Oreshnik? Offer some insights on the new missile and explain if it really is an ICBM or modified RU-26 IRBM, which stands for Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile. Pavel, give us some of and please explain where this is going and how is it tied to the nuclear strategy that Putin announced on November the 19th. The floor is yours, Pavel.
Good morning, Glenn. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's my honor and pleasure to be a co-panelist with such a great experts like General Breedlove, like Andrei Illarionov. So thank you very much. Let's start from doctrine. Russia updated its nuclear doctrine November 19th, 2024, just 4 years after the previous update. What is the key point of this update? The key point is that.
Oh, Pavel, can I ask you to turn on your video?
Yeah. I turn on.
Andre, you can turn yours on as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
The key point is that Russia is trying to go from deterrence, nuclear deterrence, to nuclear intimidation of countries which are considered as Russia's adversaries. So, United States, NATO members, especially France and United Kingdom, and other American allies. So, Russia is trying to intimidate the West, and that is the only new point within the doctrine. That is the sense of this update, and nothing else I can add here. So towards the Oreshnik missile, it is a much more interesting topic here, because it looks like Oreshnik or Cedar, like Ukrainian side claims. It looks like an updated version of RS-26 Rubesh missile, which was in development during 2010s, since the beginning of 2010s until 2018, when the research and development program has been closed. So, what does it mean, RS-26 missile? It is a lighter version of YARS, intercontinental ballistic missile. So, the mass of YARS is 47 tons. The mass of RS-26 missile or Oreshnik missile would be somewhere in between 30 tons and 40 tons. According to statements from 10 years ago, Rubesh would be 1.5 times lighter than YARS. And everyone knows that YARS is a further development of Topol-M ICBMs. Topol-M is a further development of Topol ICBMs, and Topol ICBM was developed from RSD-10 Pioneer, intermediate range ballistic missile, which was developed in 1970s, deployed during 1980s, and dismantled after the INF treaty has been signed in 1987. So we can say that RS-26 Rubesh missile is the kind of Pioneer 2.0 or something like that.
So let me interject. You don't agree that the Oreshnik is actually it's the same thing as an RU-26, and you know this why? Where did you get your data on why you're saying it could be this maybe hybrid version of the Topol?
Topol missiles, they are dismantled right now because they old and currently they do not exist. Topol-M, yes, they still operational, and Topol-M are also old enough, and now the only solid fuel ICBM which is produced in Russia is YARS ICBM, What is the difference between Topol M, YARS, ICBMs? There are two main differences. First of all, it's a solid fuel, because Russia has been working on upgraded formulas of solid fuel for decades, and it was a hard challenge for Russia. So solid fuel and command control system, because even Topol and Topol M, they had a command control system produced in Ukraine. YARS ICBM has a command control system produced in Russia. So,
and that's because Russia no longer produces strategic missiles through the Ukrainian facility in Dnipropetrovsk. Is that? Yevden Mach is the facility, right?
Ukraine produced not only missiles. Ukraine also produced command control systems in Kharkiv. So there was a big enough supply chain, and Russia tried to eliminate Ukrainian factories from the loop since 1990s. Boris Yeltsin was the first who ordered to eliminate Ukrainian suppliers from the supply chains. Related to strategic missiles, to strategic arsenal. So it was a long, very long story. But why do Russia need this RS-26 Rubesh or Oreshnik missile or something like that? Why do Russia need this? If Russia has YARS missiles, they perfectly work according to the test flights and so on and so on. My answer is that Oreshnik is a lighter version of YARS. So if it is a lighter version of YARS, you need less sophisticated solid fuel on board. And you can produce more missiles a year than YARS. Because currently we may assess the production rate, the annual production rate of YARS as 16 missile a year. 10 years ago it was 10 to 12 missiles a year. Now 16 missiles a year. If Oreshnik is 1.5 times lighter, so you can increase the production rate, at least in terms of fuel, in 1.5 times. So you can produce 25 missiles a year instead of 16 missiles a year. So makes sense, especially if you are limited in your industrial capacity.
And let me clarify one thing with you. Is your interpretation of the Oreshnik that it's a mobile missile that you can transport it around and move it?
Oh, YARS is, also has two versions: mobile version and silo version. I presume Oreshnik has the mobile versions only. The mobile version only. And that means what? That means you may transport this to some points of the world. Because we saw, like, Russia deployed non-strategic nuclear weapon in Belarus. Why we cannot imagine that one day Russia will try to organize, I don't know, another operation 2.0. like the Soviet Union did in 1962, and that's how the Caribbean crisis started, when the Soviet Union tried to deploy intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba. So hypothetically, if you do have a lighter version, lighter mobile launcher, you may easily transport this all across Russia, or you may transport this to Belarus, or why not to other points of this world. Especially considering the fact that Russia always try to imitate equality with the United States. I mean, if the United States is deploying long-range missiles somewhere in Pacific Ocean or in the Pacific region in some military bases, why we cannot think that Russia can do the same? Especially considering the fact that recently Russia signed a strategic cooperation treaty with North Korea.
Well, that's certainly that is an element I want to get to later in the discussion, and when we go a little bit further in depth. But the one thing that I want you to kind of mention here is, and clarify, people in our audience may not understand the background on some of the nuclear treaties and arms control agreements that Russia, or before the Soviet Union, had with the United States. So the Oreshnik is not technically a violation of the INF agreement, the intermediate range, the INF agreement. How's that stand? An intermediate range nuclear forces agreement. And so it's also a START agreement, which is Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, has also ended. The United States pulled out of that, right? And there's no longer the INF has also lapsed. So this development of a new missile occurs in the background of not having any types of arms control restrictions. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. There is no any treaty which currently prevents Russian efforts in development and deployment of such type of missiles. And also, besides all the sophisticated hypothetical points that Russia may transport these missiles somewhere else besides Russian territory, we should mention one more reason why Russia is trying to get Oreshnik. Its reason is that Russian strategic arsenal is decreasing, because there is no Topol ICBM anymore. There is no Satan liquid fuel ICBMs anymore. There are two.
And why is that inventory being reduced or decreased?
Because of age.
Oh, the aging of the missile. Okay.
Yes.
They need a new.
Yes.
Okay.
They are aging faster than Russia produced new missiles.
Mm-hmm.
And Russia has two missile brigades, one in Orenburg, another one in Kyiv, which do not have too many missiles, because the missile division or brigade in Kyiv, it's Uria missile division. They have only so-called signal missiles. It's a part of the Russian dead hand system. So signal missile in case of nuclear war, in case of elimination of Russian political leadership, Uria missile division must launch a signal missile which will broadcast a signal to signal to other missile divisions to launch their nuclear armed missiles. So, but Yuri itself does not have armed missiles. So it's the kind of empty missile division. Orenburg missile division has old-fashioned liquid fuel silo-based UR-100 UTTH missiles armed with avant-garde hypersonic nuclear armed gliders. But the total amount of these missiles was about 30, and currently only 6 to 9 of them are in surveys. So other missiles are also aging. So what to do? Let's start to produce a lighter version of YARS missiles. Let's produce more of them, and let's deploy them in these empty or half-empty missile divisions. That is also a reason.
So you're saying that there's a limited amount of these missiles. You have an aging nuclear infrastructure, and there's rumors that they may only have about 10 of the Oreshnik have been built. They have a limited amount of production. But just to clarify for our audience, the range limitations of the Oreshnik are believed to be it's not an intercontinental ballistic missile, so therefore it's an intermediate range missile. And we're talking about ability to strike anywhere in Europe, correct? Is that the...
We don't know, because if the missile has a range of 5,500 kilometers, so it is intercontinental ballistic missile. So when Rubesh was in development in 2010s, and when we get more information, there was a data that the range of Rubesh would be from 2,000 kilometers to 6,000 kilometers. So technically, according to treaties, it is intercontinental ballistic missile, because it is more than 5,500 kilometers. But in reality, it is a kind of intermediate range ballistic missile, because it can hardly achieve American territory, but it can achieve European territory. So, and again, we are back to intimidation, because Russia is trying to intimidate the West, and Russia is trying to divide the European allies from the United States, like the Soviet Union did in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, trying to divide them, trying to divide NATO.
So one of your big arguments is that the launching of the Oreshnik was more towards a European audience. Is that's designed to intimidate Europe as a part of what? And I think the term that I'm going to begin using is nuclear coercion strategy. I think that there's what I call a toolkit of Russian nuclear coercion strategy, and the Oreshnik is kind of part of that messaging. So what I'm going to do now is stop here, come back to you in a second. You've made a very strong argument that the messaging behind the launching of the Oreshnik missile was for European audiences, but others think that maybe the audience was somewhere else. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our distinguished guest, Andrei Illarionov. Andrei, one of your big arguments is that the launching of the Oreshnik had another audience was intended, and this audience was actually lives in Mar-a-Lago. So can you go into that and explain your theory and ideas on what the messaging and what was the Kremlin trying to do, and what was President Putin trying to do behind the launching of the Oreshnik? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for inviting me. And this is a great pleasure and honor to be at the panel organized by Saratoga Foundation for this very timely and I would say even urgent discussion. And I also was very glad to listen to Pavel, and I'm looking forward to listening to Philip and also to you, Glenn, for all our participation. So we have several pieces of information. We don't know everything, and that is why I would like to use those pieces of information that are available for us to try to decipher them and to try to build a more or less coherent version of the event. So what kind of pieces of information are available for all of us? We have at least 5 serious pieces. The first one is the launch of this missile, this glide, and the hit on Dnieper on November 21st, with all related to that. Second statement of Putin the same day, later that day. Next day we had Putin's discussion with the so-called military people, with missile producers, and so on. Third, we had its fourth already will be the statement of Putin from Astana, from this security treaty organization meeting. And the fifth piece, very interesting one that I would like to attract everybody's attention to, is the yesterday publications in New York Times concerning the telephone communication between the chief of General Staff Gerasimov with the chief with his counterpart on the American side, General Brown, in which General Gerasimov said that the preparation of this launch of Oreshnik was much earlier, before United States administration gave permission to use ATACMS against Russian assets in Kursk and other pieces of the Russian territory. So it appears that if this information is correct, it looks like it's more or less correct because it's information from Pentagon. So the words of Gerasimov are clearly contradict to what Mr. Putin told us and was telling for several occasions. So how to understand it? How we can just try to decipher all this? So I have at least 5 important pieces. What we need to look at. First, timing. Timing is November 21st. Why it happened at this exactly date? Pavel already discussed technical characteristics of the missile and of this glide, and from anyone's understanding, it's clear that these missile and this glide were ready to use whatever testing regime or experimental regime, not in the last few days. It was possible to use earlier. We don't know exactly when earlier, but definitely earlier. It relates to the violation of the treaty of year 2019. But now we are not talking about the violation because we suspected that Russian side did violate this treaty even before year 2019. But what is important, the timing, and the only reasonable thing exists about that it happened after November 5th. So that is why it could be used before that. But Putin decided on purpose to use this so-called test launch after November 5th. It means it related somehow to the US presidential election and to the results of this US presidential election. Second, which is quite important, it is communication with the US administration, with the current US administration. We know at least about 2 warnings that have been issued to the US administration. The first one was probably a couple of days or 3 days before the launch, and this warning led US administration to issue public warning, and Mr. Miller, press secretary of the State Department, has talked about this on November 20th, 1 day before the actual launch. So that is why US administration did expect this particular launch, and even ordered US embassy in Kyiv to close operation that day and probably next day as well. So that is why it was not a surprise. It was to some extent informed, and another warning was 30 minutes before the launch, as we also have been informed. And it is very strange, because usually this channel for communication exists for launch of either intercontinental ballistic missiles or for missiles with nuclear weapons. It is neither case. It is neither intercontinental ballistic missile, and it's everybody, Mr. Putin, underscored that it was not nuclear missile. Even more shocking that since this case, since November 21st, the current US administration never condemned launch of this missile. This is the first time in history use of such type of ballistic missile against the city with 1 million population, with essentially civil targets. It's a very demonstrative, it's a lot of attention, but neither Pentagon nor State Department nor the White House ever condemned this case. Since then, there was several opportunities for very high officials from the current administration to use different platforms to do it. And they have condemned use of North Korean troops on the Russian territory. They use their deployment, even just same day and next day on November 21st and November 22nd, both press secretary of Pentagon and press secretary of White House 5 or even 6 times during their statements condemned deployment of North Korean troops. Not a single one condemnation of this hit and this missile. And this is shocking fact. Putting aside even just any attempt, maybe it's technically impossible at this moment, just even use any resources of the United States to try to strike this missile and so on, just putting aside, but no verbal condemnation. Next one, this is very interesting, is a change in the rhetoric of Mr. Putin from November 21st statement to his rhetoric on November 22nd during the meeting with military. On 21st, Putin used such words like America or American, United States, NATO, West 16 times, and only 3 times the word Europe. Next day, in his conversation with military and these missile producers, how many times did he use words America, US, NATO, the West? The answer, 0. And the only word has been used during that conversation is Europe, and discussion of mid-range missiles, which is very clear shift in attracting public attention from the United States during the November 21st meeting to Europe at November 22nd meeting. Next point is what was the goal of this hit. We know this was Dnipro, this was Mach or 15 Mach, whatever, the largest missile enterprise in the former Soviet Union, maybe in the whole world for a substantial portion of the Cold War. Why? And second point here would be because it was a so-called test hit or experimental, whether any serious damage has been made to this enterprise. And we all know the answer. No, it was minuscule. It was only demonstrative. It was only symbolic. So everything related to this event is symbolic, demonstrative. So that is why we understand this is not some kind of the use of these weapons, not in real battle, but is just for demonstration. It is message. And we need to decipher this message. To whom and what exactly this message means. Let me, after all of that, just to to put them together and to give my interpretation of this message. I like the word coercion that Pavel was using, and I agree with that. I think it's a coercive act, but what kind of coercive? It is not necessarily nuclear coercion. It definitely might be, and Putin underscored that it is missiles in non-nuclear use, so it can be used also in nuclear version, no doubt. But he played with nuclear and non-nuclear, regardless what would be the reaction of the world and what response might be from the United States, first of all, and from other NATO capitals. But I understand this is like a message for coercive negotiations with not outgoing US administration, but with incoming administration. And the question is, what should be the substance? What should be the content of these negotiations? Ukraine? I'm not sure, because mid-range missile with possible use with nuclear weapons, it is not for Ukraine. It is not for Moldova. It is not for Baltic countries. It is for Europe, for European capitals. It is not a coincidence that participants of the meetings with Putin were discussing the range of this missile. They underscore that whole territory of Europe now is under cover of this, within the reach of this missile, and this is the mid-range missiles. This is aimed at Europe, but if it is aimed at Europe, it is also aimed at NATO, and it is also aimed at the United States in Europe. And putting them together, or all of this together, I would say this is a very strong message. I would say this is a message for incoming, for possible negotiations with incoming US administration about the arrangement for system of international security in Europe, which goes in line with the so-called proposals of Putin back in year 2021, when he offered two drafts of treaties, one with NATO and one with the United States, in December 21. And we do remember the main idea of those documents the whole thrust of Putin's actions back then, 3 years ago, is to push United States out of Europe, to shift the so-called front line in Europe to the so-called 1997 front line, which means denatoization of Central Europe. Putin publicly claimed and demanded that NATO and United States would leave Central Europe, and all countries that became members of NATO since 1997 should cease to become members of these organizations, and all assets and institutions of NATO and the collective security system in Europe should be moved back to 1997 frontline. My last point would be, do we believe that is the last demand of Mr. Putin? Definitely no. If that happens, so next day, or next month, or next year, Putin would come with new demands. But for the moment, his demands are very clear, and now his demands for the same negotiations that he was asking for in November, December 21, are backed with a new argument. This argument we saw on November 21st in Dnipro.
Andrei, let me, I want to ask you further to your comment. You make a really good point about where this was targeted and being aimed at NATO. How should we read the statement by the Russian tycoon, oligarch, if you want to call him, Konstantin Malafeyev, 2 days ago gave an interview to the Financial Times. And in that interview, he was basically kind of mocking the Trump administration and Keith Kellogg and the idea of trying to resolve the Ukraine war and having peace talks to end it. And basically, he clearly indicated, Malafeyev, that something bigger has to be in store for Putin and to even engage in discussions with the West and the Trump administration. And basically, he put the whole on the thing on the table that Europe and getting out of NATO is what he hinted at. So how should we interpret what Malafeyev said? Because that seems to echo and reinforce the very arguments you're making right now.
I think that he's doing exactly what he's expected to do, and is, I don't know the extent to which this interview coordinated with Kremlin, but definitely it goes in line with main Kremlin idea. Incoming negotiations, or expected negotiations, whether they will be or not, but just it is widely expected negotiations, will be not only about Ukraine. Definitely, it will be about Ukraine, but not only. And the main points of the possible negotiations have been formulated by Putin and by a number of representatives of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs back then in 21, like Mr. Rybkov and many others, and they have been reiterated not once since then. It is not only about Ukraine. It's about European security system. And Putin said not once that he is not happy with the current situation and he wants to change it. So that is why these interviews that you are referring to is just one more element hinting that whoever will be involved in those negotiations on the American side, whether General Kellogg or whoever, they must be prepared. This is the message. They must be prepared to put more in this basket. So that is why it's one more element in raising stakes in those negotiations. I would probably add one more point to just my initial statement concerning little damage to huge Mach as a result of this hit. if we look into these almost 3 years Russian-Ukrainian war, we look how many times Mach has been hit by Russian attacks. And we know 4 times. This is the 4th time. Whether any of this attack serious? No. Mach essentially is intact. Even we all know and Ukrainians know they're using those facilities to produce important military hardware for armed forces of Ukraine, for production, for repair, for also. And Putin essentially never tried to hit this one of the most important, if not the most important, military production facility in Ukraine. The question is why? Because he hopes, he wants, and he hopes that he would get it intact at some point, whether as a result of military operations or as a result of diplomatic negotiations. Why he needs Mach? As Pavel explained it very well, and as we all know, Mach is one of the best facilities to produce missiles, mid-range missiles, as well as intercontinental ballistic missiles.
And you're referring to the Soviet period. It was a nuclear construction plant for missiles that's very impregnable. It has many stories underground. In fact, it could resist. Rumors are that it could resist a nuclear attack, and that was the purpose for building it. Is that correct, Andre?
Yes, and we understand that to get Mach, he needs not to fight Ukraine. And once again, not Moldova, not Baltics. It is for Western Europe and for the United States.
So,
and this is a very clear message that Putin is sending, that yes, I have this weapon, I can use this weapon, but I'm not going to use this weapon against facilities that I'm going to get and to use in reasonable future. One more point, as we remember, in Astana, Putin said something very interesting that probably did not get enough attention internationally. He said something. He was bragging that at the moment Russia is producing 10 times more missiles than all NATO combined. And he said that okay, next year he's going to produce 30-40% more missile than this year. Certainly, we should not take it Putin's word for 100% guarantee, but probably to some extent, this statement is related to real situation. At this moment, probably Russia produces more missiles than at least European members of NATO. It looks like it's a realistic assessment. Why Putin needs so many missiles? Only we don't know. He did not specify what kind of missiles, whether it's intercontinental, mid-range, lesser lengths. But this is also a statement for new negotiations with incoming administration. So it is coercive negotiations. It's a blackmail. It is threat that he is ready, and he is putting new cards on the table for these potential negotiations.
You're absolutely right, and I think you make a couple of really good arguments, and we're going to circle back to you after we give Phil the floor. But I wanted to say a couple things. The statement when Malafeyev made it to the Financial Times, he said, "quote unquote, we want a long-term peace, some sort of general agreement about the global order." And he said, Trump wants to go down in history. He'll be 80 soon. He's a grandfather. Putin's not 50 anymore either. It'll be the legacy they both leave us. So this statement, I totally agree with you. There's a lot in this statement in terms of the launching of the Oreshnik that go with that. And also on a note for Keith Kellogg and the negotiations, Putin could also be hinting at that in any future negotiations, he wants to use Mach back. And so as a form of negotiations, and I think that even that scenario of Russia getting back, use Mach, and the ability to produce strategic missiles at that facility would be immense. And I don't think many of the Republicans that are encouraging Trump to engage in negotiations with Ukraine and Russia and brokering a deal, they need to look at the strategic environment and what this may cause. Now, Phil, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Andre and our colleague Pavel have really painted a picture that's quite frightening to me. And where do you stand on all this, and what do you think about everything that you've heard today?
Well, first of all, Glenn, thanks for having me, and it's a delight to listen to Pavel and Andre. Their insight is amazing. My head has been down because I've taken so many notes so far from what they've said. And let me just say right up front, because I am going to get controversial a little bit. Let me say right up front, I am in violent agreement with almost everything these two gentlemen have said. I take a few of their points slightly differently than they do, but I absolutely agree with their insights, and I appreciate their insights. Let me just get controversial right up front. There's all kinds of discussion about this new missile and what this new missile did and the capabilities of this new missile and what it means and all this stuff. I'm not excited about any of that. What most excites me is the policy decision that Putin would make to fire this missile at this particular time and what he expects to gain from it. Honestly, we watched years ago in Syria fires from the Caspian Sea all the way into particular targets in Syria. Mr. Putin can already hold all of Russia at risk. All of Russia, I meant all of Europe at risk. And so there's nothing to me new and exciting about the capabilities of this missile. What is extremely intriguing to me is that he has decided to use it, and as Andre said, the timing of this and what it all means, that is the important point. It's not that I disagree with anything said. I react very differently to this than a lot have. Mr. Putin got exactly what he wanted from the American press. Andre was very clear, and I agree with him. The rhetoric of the U.S. after the shot was not about the shot. Okay, he's exactly right. It was a different set of concerns, mostly about North Korean troops. And so, the United States government, I don't think, wanted to make a big show of, oh no, there's something new that we have to fear even more. I think that, however, the U.S. press went crazy and did exactly what Mr. Putin wanted. The U.S. press was all wrapped up on, it's World War III. Are we in World War III? Is there a nuclear threat? Well, we see nuclear explosions. What is going, and there was this, I think, almost childish overreaction by the U.S. press trying to incite the fear of this new weapon that had been used. And I would just close this thought by saying once again, the capability that this particular weapon brings to the battlefield doesn't surprise me or worry me at all. What worries me more is that Mr. Putin is thinking of using these kinds of things, and he actually pulled the trigger on one. And that tells me how emboldened he is right now in his actions. And may I also, and I hope my two more learned colleagues may correct me in a minute, But I think there's a certain amount of desperation in Mr. Putin as well. His military has been fighting Ukraine for 10 years, actually almost 10 and a half years. A world superpower has been fighting in Ukraine, and they haven't defeated them yet. And that is a problem for Mr. Putin. His army, in many ways, has failed him. His Air Force is beginning to now have impact on the battlefield. But for the first nine and a half years, his Air Force was not having real impact on the battlefield. The Air Force was having a lot of impact on the civilians and the civilian structures of Ukraine, but they were having almost no impact on the military until in the recent months. This is what we call counter value targeting versus counter force targeting. And Russia was largely unable of being able to do very well orchestrated counter force targeting. So they employed most of their weapons indiscriminately into civilian areas. And so I've been on a rant here, but I think that we have to understand what Mr. Putin was facing, why he used it. He's trying to regain some momentum. He sees this opportunity of the changing of the guard in the United States, and his timing was impeccable. And the U.S. press gave him most of what he wanted as far as shock value on using this particular weapon. I think that and both of the commentators both talked about how Putin is using this, and I love some of the words used. I'm going to steal this phrase. We have moved from deterrence to intimidation in the nuclear field. This is a wonderful way of capturing a set of thoughts that I had before. And I think that what I would say is, using older words and maybe not as creative words, is this is really about Mr. Putin's war of intimidation, or if you want to use the very academic word, the idea of reflexive control. This is Mr. Putin using the tools that he can to try to affect change in his enemy in ways that he has not yet been able to affect change by the use of his blunt force military. Obviously, Russia has shown some battlefield gains. But remember, this is a world superpower that's been fighting Ukraine for 10 and a half years. And they have not yet been able to truly accomplish their goals in disassembling the nation of Ukraine and the leadership of Ukraine. So I think that the discussions that we should have in the West is, how do we respond to these maneuvers of reflexive control, intimidation, or moving a nuclear strategy from deterrence to intimidation. And I frankly don't think the West is ready for this yet. Nobody is seriously talking about how you address this. And I would like to point to the following. Mr. Trump wrote a book, The Art of the Deal. I bought it. I didn't read the whole book, but all my friends said you have to read chapter 6, because chapter 6 is what happens. Mr. Trump talks about what you do when you're about to enter into a negotiation. And to really badly paraphrase chapter 6, it says you should set the bar extremely high. So then you can then negotiate back from that and be seen as a good guy in the negotiations. Well, what I hear in the West right now is our starting point for the possible upcoming negotiations about Ukraine is capitulation. We are talking about giving Mr. Putin everything he asks for. And that's our starting point of negotiation. This is a failure. This is really bad policy. This does not align with Mr. Trump's Chapter 6 of setting a high bar and negotiating back. We should never begin a negotiation from abject capitulation. And I got beat up recently about this. What do you mean capitulation? Mr. Putin's going to agree to a ceasefire. That is not a concession. Mr. Putin needs a ceasefire. His army is nearly worn out. He is having to ask North Koreans to come retake sovereign Russian territory. That'd be like us here in America asking the Brits to come over here and defend us from Mexico or something. I mean, this is crazy. And now we even understand that there are Middle Eastern soldiers via the Houthis on the battlefield. Mr. Putin desperately needs a ceasefire so that he can reconstitute his forces. We should never see a ceasefire as a concession by Mr. Putin. He needs it. He's counting on it in this new negotiation. So the bottom line is he is making some steady gains in the East at incredible cost in manpower, his economy, and other things. And we should see all of that as a negotiation point of strength. And we should set the bar high in this negotiation upcoming. We should be talking about how much land Mr. Putin will have to give back to Ukraine as a starting point for this negotiation, rather than what we hear. Once again, I would say what we hear out there is starting this negotiation from a standpoint of 100% abject capitulation to Mr. Putin's demands. Okay, I'm sorry. I got off on my soapbox, and I'm ready now to take spears.
Okay, so let me circle back there with you, Phil. We have the U.S. with the new Trump administration coming in, talking about negotiations. They've appointed the envoy, Keith Kellogg, to be envoy to not only Ukraine, but also to Russia. But everything we've heard today is that the messaging by Putin is all about arms control and some sort of agreement. So going back to the Republican position, just let me finish my question, is the Republicans are not known to be as friendly to arms control as Republicans. In fact, it was Republican administrations under Bush that pulled out of the previous agreement. So now, this administration is not really seen to be poised or even have people that can engage and talk about arms control. I respect Keith Kellogg, but he's not a Paul Nitze, right? I mean, so this is what I'm wondering about, and I want you to wear your Fulda Gap hat from the days of the Cold War. You remember the deployments of the Pershing missiles, and the Pershing missiles were in reaction to the SS-20. And the Russians thought that they had us on the SS-20 because it could threaten Europe. And it's almost a similar repeat of what they were doing before. So then the U.S., with President Reagan's resolve, deployed the Pershing and said, come hell or high water, we're going through with this. So going back to the issue of arms control and this incoming Republican administration, and knowing everything that you know about what we went through back in the 80s, it seems like this administration and what the U.S. are going to be unprepared for this. In fact, they may not even be anticipating what Malafeyev was hinting at in his Financial Times interview, which was, we want to talk about the global order. So, in other words, everything's on the table here. It's not just Ukraine. And I don't think these people and the incoming administration are fully fathoming what the Russians have in store for them. So over to you.
So let me just disagree with your question a tiny bit, the way you formulated it. Everything is not on the table. The way I see this rolling out is Russia has already pocketed everything they want vis-a-vis Ukraine. In other words, Mr. Trump had some conversation with Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, since that time, has said, I'm not accepting your terms. We're going to dictate the terms. We're going to accelerate the attack. We're going to fire more missiles into Ukraine. He sent a very clear message that he does not accept Mr. Trump's terms. And so the moving on to a larger conversation of arms control and the sort of Western order, as Andre talked about, getting back to the two documents. That is all because in Mr. Putin's mind, he's moved back past the initial concept of this discussion. He's already pocketed that the West is going to give me everything I want vis-a-vis Ukraine. And now he's adding on this extra layer of demands about arms control, moving NATO out of the near abroad, all of the things, as Andre laid out, that were originally described in these two documents that were handed to us about 11 days before the latest round of fighting began almost 3 years ago. So I think that we should not, Glenn, you're a brain. I don't ever really disagree with you, but I would just say I would formulate your question differently. I don't think everything is on the table. I think in Putin's mind, he's already pocketed all his demands and a ceasefire. And all of that is in his favor. I haven't seen really what is in Ukraine's favor in any of the things discussed in the public today. But Mr. Putin in his mind has moved on now, and he's trying to get to these more lofty goals that were described in those original documents some 3 years ago. So I think that we have to keep this in mind. We need to go into these negotiations with the position that incurs cost on Russia, not just cost on Ukraine.
Bill, I want to introduce, there's another element when you said you want things you want to talk about that were also on your chest, and Andre alluded to this. And the other part about hitting Pivden, Mach, and Dnipro is about Ukrainians' statements that they're going to start their own strategic ballistic missile program. And so the other side of this coin here is what the Ukrainians have been saying and intimating about, well, you want a peace deal. Well, we're going to develop ballistic missiles, and we view this as a part of our deterrence package, and it was given away in Budapest. So where you wanted to talk about that as well. And Andre, I'm going to come back to you. You had also mentioned this, and Pavel, don't feel forgotten. We'll come back and let you weigh in here as well, because there's a lot of things on the table behind the launching of the Oreshnik. And the other part of it about hitting Pivden, Mach is the impact on what Ukraine is trying to do with its own ballistic missile strategy. So, Phil?
So I need to digress and widen for about 1 minute, and then I'll take another minute to get to the point you want to talk about. But I'm often asked about what our strategies are around the world. You know, what's our strategy towards North Korea now? What's our strategy towards Taiwan? What's our strategy towards Iran? What's our strategy or policy towards Russia and China? And this actually happened in a class I teach among PhD students, and I gave them a short amount of time, and I put all of those things on the board, and I said, Google real quick and look up what our government says our strategies are here. And these are really good people. They know how to find these things. And so we came back around, and each in about 2 or 3 seconds described the strategies, you know, one country, two systems, all the things that we say out there in the world about our policies around the world. And then they asked me, so, what's the object of the exercise? What do you think our policies are? And I said it like this, you know, knuckle dragon fighter pilots, we like to keep things very simple. I said, here's what my mother told me when I was a young man. My mother said that people do not care what you say. People watch closely and care about what you do. So we have all of these policies around the world, but people are watching us in Ukraine. And what they see in Ukraine is if the West, and specifically if the United States, is threatened with nuclear attack, it backs up. It backs up. So it's more, the question you ask is about Ukraine's ballistic missile and nuclear program. I would offer to you that there are a lot of people around the world saying, If that's what nuclear weapons do to the United States of America, we want nuclear weapons. I think that there are several nations out there that are going to speed up their development of nuclear weapons. I also think that on the blue side, on the friendly side, we are seeing some people that are thinking, oh my gosh, can we count on the United States? Do we need to develop our own nuclear weapons? And I think that the way that we in the West, and specifically we in the United States, are acting on the global stage is inciting development of nuclear programs, vice stopping them. I think you know, we here at the Georgia Tech Institute of Technology and the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, we believe in arms control. We believe in trying to avoid nuclear warfare. Senator Nunn and the other people in the ELN, European Leadership Network, they speak all the time about you cannot fight and win a nuclear war, and they want to avoid it. Sadly, I'll just close with restating what I said a minute ago. I think that our actions around the world, not our policies, not our written or spoken policies, but our actions, specifically in Ukraine, they are going to cause people, and most likely the Ukrainians, to want to develop nuclear weapons because they see how debilitating they are to U.S. policy.
Andre, Pavel, which you want to weigh in?
If I may, just to continue what Philip was talking about, looks like the person who did read Chapter 6 in Art of Deal is Mr. Putin, because he does exactly what has been written there and what he actually probably acquired in his own life, because it's exactly the way how he is doing whatever how long we know him for last quarter of century. He is raising the stakes. He is riding the bar. So the main conclusion from what we see over this period of time for the incoming US administration is, first, the positive sign for over now just 1 month since November 5th US presidential election, that President-elect does not fulfill his campaign promise to start negotiations right away, just after his election as a president-elect. He did not call Mr. Putin. He did not make any statement about that. He did not formulate any position yet. And this is a positive sign that he did not do it. And the longer he is silent, the longer he is not sharing his views about that with general public and with Mr. Putin, the better. Second, when President-elect and his team could come into negotiations with Mr. Putin, not earlier than the new team would prepare the highest possible bars for these negotiations. Not earlier. And it might take time. It means that it will not be January 20th, January 21st. It may be not within weeks or months or years of new administration. And this is probably the strongest advice I would propose, I would offer to the incoming administrations, not to rush with negotiations if you are not prepared for them. You enter them only when you have all necessary assets that you can have reasonable, rational, responsible negotiations on behalf not only Ukraine, but on behalf of NATO, behalf of Europe, and behalf of the United States. Since Philip is absolutely right when he is saying that it's not everything on the table yet. And it will come, as it appears back in 21, when everybody concentrated attention on Ukraine, and all of a sudden appears these two draft treaties that looks like was not related necessarily with Ukraine, but Putin put them as an alienable part of the incoming negotiations. Why he would not repeat the same trick again? Actually, he's already repeating this trick. And only blind and deaf cannot see and cannot hear what Mr. Putin is saying and doing exactly right now. And I would add probably one more point. In any negotiations, real negotiations or so-called quasi-negotiations, because even by doing, not only talking, there's a very important distinction. What the US and the Western side is doing, it is necessary to know the weak point of Mr. Putin. And we know weak point and weak points of Mr. Putin. And those weak points must be exploited in favor of not only of the West, but European security architecture, and I would say world security. What are those weak points? The first one is missiles. Exactly. Missiles probably even more important than nuclear by itself. With nuclear so much related, so many people are not happy about that everywhere, including in China, in India, in the rest of the world. So that is why it's good to use as a blackmail, but not good to use. So that is why, yes, it is potential, it's impossible to exclude it, but it is so-called, it's not a very active weapon. Missiles are active weapon that can be used, and we've seen it. They have been used, including mid-range ballistic missiles. So, and Putin publicly said that he's going to use them. And we also know where he's going to use. So that is why the critical element, and actually, by the way, I checked Mr. Putin's statements, comments, interviews for last 25 years. And I found that the most recurring topic in all his topics, all his public statements from year 2000 up to date is missiles. It is real obsession of him with missiles, even more than with Ukraine. And it looks like Ukraine is kind of the result of his obsession with missiles. You probably remember how many times he was talking about the potential deployment of missiles on the territory of Ukraine, about the distance between Kharkiv and Moscow if US or Western missiles would be deployed somewhere near Kharkiv. So that is why Ukraine, to some extent, can be considered as the so-called evolution of his obsession with missiles. And third element, so that's just missile bombs themselves, missiles on the territory of Ukraine, and the third, anti-missile defense in Europe. We do remember from year 2006, year 2007, all these anti-missiles defense district in Poland, Romania, which was slowly developing now, but what kind of resistance from Mr. Putin was back then. So there are three elements. Intensive development of missile program in Ukraine first. Second, deployment of Western missiles on Ukrainian territory second. And development of anti-missile defense for whole Europe, especially for all front states, starting with Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, up to north, to Baltic countries and Finland. And those three elements should be three most important bargain chips, leverages for real actions and for any possible negotiations with Putin or somebody instead of Putin in future.
Thank you. You make some great points. Pavel, you want to quickly comment?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Andrei Larionov just said, with what General Bluff just said. I may add just a couple of points. First of all, Ukraine really needs on its own intermediate range ballistic missiles. Not too many of them, just maybe several tens of them, conventionally armed. Because, for instance, if Ukraine will be able to hit Votkinsk missile plant in Votkinsk, it's Udmurtian Republic, Russia will not be able to produce intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russia will not be able to produce Oreshnik missiles, and Russia will not be able to produce even Iskander tactical ballistic missiles. So asymmetric actions are possible. The only trouble is that to create intermediate range ballistic missile is not so easy task, and Ukraine needs assistance from the Western partners here. Another point: why is Russia hurrying right now? Why is Russia in a rush towards negotiations, towards the ceasefire? Because when we look at recent massive missile strikes against Ukraine made by Russia, by the Russian air forces, we can see only 16 to 95 strategic bombers, whereas other from 30 to 40 bombers. We can see 7 to 160 strategic bombers, whereas other 11 of them. Why we still see Soviet era and Ukraine-made engines on the new Russian long-range cruise missiles? Where are Russia-made engines? Yes, Russia produced some of the engines, but for me, it seems that Russia still relies and still dependent on the stockpiles of the engines made in the Soviet era in late 1980s. So maybe that's the answer. Why Russia is in a hurry.
Well, let me interrupt you. What you're saying is that there's shortages. There's shortages of the engines.
Yes, Russia is weakening. Russia is weakening not so fast like we want, but Russia is weakening inevitably, irreversibly. And that's why Russia is crucially needs on ceasefire, and why Russia shouldn't be provided with ceasefire. And Andrei said very clear, don't be in a hurry with in negotiations with Russia, because Russia is weakening, and the most of Soviet era stockpiles will be exhausted by the second half of 2025.
So the depletion rate is what you're saying is everywhere across the board, not just about missile engines, but depletion rates and manpower, everything else. It's kind of reaching that.
Yes, point. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Phil, you want to have some concluding comments here before we wrap up?
No, I think this has been wonderful. Again, I'm warning you two gentlemen, I'm stealing a few of your words. I will properly attribute them to you. But I think that some good advice has been made here, and that is that we should sort of get prepared and make sure that we are prepared before we enter into this discussion. We should set a different standard for what success looks like. We should not accept capitulation to all of Mr. Putin's demands. We need to recognize, as Andre said, the weak points of Mr. Putin and exploit them, because these are things we've been watching for a long time. As we started building Devaselu and then we started building in Poland, we saw the angst of the Russians about these missile defense capabilities and the ability of the radars to guide other systems. And so these are things that we need to exploit. Mr. Putin needs to understand his hand in this card game is not the winning hand in the end. And then we'll get to where we need to be. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you raise a really very great point. Andre, you've talked about Ukraine being the evolution of Putin's obsession with missiles. That's also a very fascinating point. And then, Pavel, your last point about the depletion rate of the Russian military with its own engines for strategic bombers. That's also very, very insightful. So I wanted to thank everyone. I think we have accomplished our goal today, which was to discuss all the implications of the Oreshnik launching. What does it mean? And what did Putin gain from the launching of the Oreshnik missile? And I think we've covered this extensively. And I agree with what Andre said at the very beginning of the discussion, that this is an urgent issue that needs to be discussed. It kind of came, it was in the headlines, and then it went away. And so that was the purpose on why the Saratoga Foundation today wanted to have this discussion with you, our wonderful guests, and sharing your great insight. So on behalf of everyone, thank you. Board member Phil Breedlove, thank you. Pavel, senior fellow, Andre, you're always great. So we love what you have to say. So keep it coming. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.